Women in the Islamic Empire and Sparta.
Even just for a day.
Both Islamic and Greek societies were patriarchal. Although women were given some rights, men had more power. In both societies, lineage was traced through the man's side of the family. Women took the last names of men and lived in the man's house. Men also had more control over the family's money, and the men had the final say on any decision. Also, punishments for crimes were also harsher for women. Men were able to get away with breaking the law much more frequently than women were in both societies. Despite the fact that both societies were clearly patriarchal, women were given more rights in Sparta and in the Islamic Empire than in other civilizations existing around the same time period. For example, women could own property in both societies. A Muslim woman was given control of her own dowry. Sometimes the woman would use this money to purchase property for the family on her own. In Sparta, women owned a fairly large percentage of the property too. The men were rarely home during times of war, so the women often bought property themselves with their inheritance money, since they were the ones who lived at home full-time. Women were expected to raise children before they did anything else. In the Islamic society, women were not normally permitted to have jobs outside the house. Although some Spartan women were allowed to have jobs outside the home, they generally spent more time raising their children to be strong and disciplined soldiers or mothers, depending on the gender of their children. In a typical family in both societies, the men worked at a trade outside of the home and made money for the family, while the women handled the affairs of the house. There was spiritual equality in both societies. The Greek religion was polytheistic with many anthropomorphic gods, and the Islamic religion was monotheistic with Allah as the one God. In both religions, though, women were judged the same way as men before being condemned in the afterlife. Both men and women were judged according to their sins and were punished and rewarded in the same ways. Women in Sparta were much more independent. They were allowed to walk around town as they pleased and didn't have to worry about a male escort accompanying them. Spartan women were even responsible for defending the city when the men were away. Spartan women spent a lot of time on their own, with very few men left in the city-state during times of war. The women in Islamic society were not allowed to venture out of their houses without a male family member. They had curfews and were restricted from going certain places. Their social lives were almost entirely controlled by the men and their families. Women in Sparta were highly regarded. There were many statues and monuments dedicated to female goddesses. Women were also able to influence their husbands and sons in politics. Many men valued the opinion of the women in their lives. Even though the Spartan women couldn't make political decisions directly, they were able to influence the outcome of politics by making suggestions to their husbands and sons. Women in the Dar al-Islam were not able to take part in politics for the most part. Their opinions were not normally of great value to the men in their lives because women were considered very inferior to men. Muslim women were to be seen and not heard for the most part, so they often didn't voice their opinions about politics. Since Allah was the only God in the Islamic religion, and the Muslim people were not supposed to worship any other figures, there were not female statues of gods in the Islamic society either. Women in Sparta didn't have wardrobe restrictions. They wore togas or other loose-fitting clothing. They were not required to cover up their bodies and were allowed to leave their hair down if they so pleased. Sometimes women would even appear in public without any clothing on at all when they played sports. In the Islamic Empire, women were forced to dress very modestly. They had to wear burqas, which were outfits that covered every bit of skin and hair on women's bodies. The only exposed area was the women's eyes, and even the eyes were required to be hidden by veils. Punishments for violating the dress code were very harsh, sometimes even consisting of lashes with a metal cable in extreme cases.
I wanted, and I never get confronted for it, 'cause they stick up for me. If I were a boy, I think I could understand.
from a primary source shows that women in the Spartan society were trained to be physically fit. They were allowed to exercise the same way men were, so that they would be strong enough to bear healthy children.
When you lose the one you wanted, 'cause he's taking you for granted, and everything you had got destroyed. If I were a boy, I would turn.
This excerpt from a primary source shows that Muslim women were under the control of men. It hints that women are dependent on men and that they should be obedient towards the men in their family as a result. If women are not obedient, men should cast them away. But if women are not doing anything wrong, then men should treat them well, according to this document.
As I go, 'cause I know that she'd be faithful, waiting